Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Barbara Peters, and this is an exciting first conversation with Leonard Goldberg, who over the years has kindly signed copies of his daughter Sherlock Holmes series for us. The new edition, or the new book rather, is called The Abduction of Pretty Penny. And we've sold out of signed copies, but too bad. It's still a great book, even without the signature. So Leonard, welcome. It's really nice to meet you at last.
It's my pleasure, Barbara. Thanks for the invitation.
You're entirely welcome. So let me give you a little background on Dr. Goldberg, because he's actually quite distinguished here, in addition to being a wonderful mystery writer. He's an American physicist, professor of medicine, and the author of the Joanna Blaylock. Was it Blaylock or Blaylock? How do we pronounce it?
Blaylock.
Blaylock series of medical thrillers. His novels have been translated into a dozen languages and sold more than 1 million copies. He's a consulting physician affiliated with UCLA Medical Center, where he's a clinical professor of medicine. And he's a witness in medical malpractice trials, which is certainly excellent for a crime writer, all kinds of good experience. And he has a number of specialties, and he's published over 100 scientific studies in peer-reviewed journals. And his writing career, I love this, began with a clinical interest in blood disorders. Seriously, that's how you began writing?
Yes, I'll tell you the story. It's rather interesting. We had a patient at UCLA who had a terrible anemia, and it was caused by her making antibodies against her own red blood cells. And drugs didn't seem to help very much. And whenever we tried to give her a transfusion, her antibodies destroyed those red blood cells. So it looked pretty hopeless, and it was a downhill course. But then we read about a family who had a strange congenital abnormality. Their red blood cells didn't contain any proteins, no Rh factors, no AB, nothing. So we wondered, would this family be like a universal donor? So we contacted the family, got several units of blood, transfused the lady, and she did wonderfully well. So we had a universal donor. And at that moment, I said to myself, whoa, what if somebody was born with no tissue antigens on any of their organs, and they were a universal donor? And there was such a woman in my creation, and it was found out that she was the universal donor, and some very wealthy men who needed organ transplants began to pursue her, and they captured her. And that was the basis of my first novel, entitled Transplant. I didn't think very much. I thought, well, that's fun, good, we'll go on our way. But it went through like a dozen reprints and was optioned by a Hollywood studio, and I was bitten. I couldn't stop writing after that.
So you have a real left brain, right brain thing going on there. I love that. And medical thrillers are fascinating, although I think keeping up with the technology today must be really hard work because it seems to be evolving at lightning speed.
Oh, it's remarkable. It seems that the amount of medical information and new facts and technology, like it doubles every year. And I just don't know how you can keep up with it. I think that if you're a specialist in the one given specialty, like arthritis or rheumatology, yeah, you can do it. But if you're a general practitioner, general internist, it's got to be very difficult.
I think so too. I mean, we're really fortunate here in Scottsdale to have it's a medical center, and the Mayo Clinic has an ever increasing presence and an ever increasing footprint because they keep expanding and bringing in new things. And I feel really lucky to be a Mayo patient. My husband and I are, and have been for years. And the advantage to it is that they have all the specialists under one roof. So, even if you have sort of a GP looking after you, they call in everybody when needed. And they also, the other good thing is that they have upgraded to communicating by email and making your patient portal available to you. So you no longer have to stand in line for 5 hours to get your medical records if you actually need them. You can get them from your portal. So there's a lot of technology supporting the medical profession that's not medical.
Oh, it's, as I say, the amount of information it just doubles and triples, and it's very difficult to keep up. Mayo, of course, is one of the 5 best medical centers in America, if not the world. And if you look at most of the ratings, you'll find at the top of the list is Johns Hopkins. They're always at the top, and justifiably so. And after that are 4 or 5 other medical centers, including the Mayo, UCLA, Cleveland Clinic, the Brigham. So if you are being looked after by the Mayo, you're in good hands.
Well, it's one reason that it's, there are a lot of reasons I like living in Scottsdale, but I have to say, as I have hit 80 and my husband is not too far behind me, that it's very comforting, yeah, to know that Mayo is here. And every once in a while, when I, think about moving to New Zealand or something to escape, I recognize that that's a long way away from really good, the kind of medical care that we are used to. But I digress. Obviously, at some point, you decided that you would, in fact, abandon the technology race of today and drop back in time and write about Sherlock Holmes's daughter. Now, what interested you in creating a daughter for Sherlock Holmes, who is married to a Watson?
Well, that is a rather interesting story as well. This was in the 4th or 5th novel I'd written about the modern day Joanna Blaylock. And I got a very good review. And the reviewer said, this novel seems to flow along on the Holmesian wings of Joanna Blaylock. And as soon as I saw the word Holmesian, I thought, well, she does seem like a Sherlock Holmes to me. Maybe she's somehow related. And that was the start of the thought. Now, I didn't really carry that out until about 4 or 5 years later, but that's where it started. The Holmesian wings of Joanna Blaylock.
Well, that's a very nice phrase, I have to say, and it allows you to, use your medical background, but you're casting it back a century. In fact, I think in this book, are we not in 1917?
Yeah, 1917. And as a matter of fact, the original Joanna Blaylock, the daughter of Sherlock Holmes, is the grandmother of the modern day Joanna Blaylock. So it's the passage of genes, you would say. They went from Sherlock to his daughter, and from his daughter to her granddaughter.
Well, that's a very nice segue. But let's talk about 1917. I mean, medicine was undergoing some transformations thanks to wartime. War always seems to accelerate it. The one thing I know that really took wings during the First World War was plastic surgery, because there were so many terrible facial injuries. And, after the Civil War, as I recall, and somebody wrote a really great thriller about it, whose name I cannot remember, but he's an excellent author, about making a mask. I remember, I think they could be metal, probably were, maybe carved wood, I don't know. But anyway, when people were wounded or the snipers, their rifles took out part of their face or something, and they were so deformed, they made masks for them.
Yes.
And that was a problem in the First World War. So plastic surgery really became a more expansive branch of medicine.
Yeah, I think it really all started, excuse me, with the invention of anesthesia. During the Civil War, anesthesia was just now beginning to come onto the scene, and it was not widely used. But by the 1900s, early 1900s, anesthesia, particularly ether, was available generally. And that is when you could perform more drastic surgery, whether it's facial reconstruction or orthopedic surgery, this sort of thing. So it was the anesthesia which allowed them to do it as much as anything.
Wow, that's so true. I mean, before you just basically got people drunk. When they had a television version of John Adams and his family, his older daughter had breast cancer. And there's a perfectly ghastly scene, in which they're going to operate to remove her breast, try to remove the lump. And, she's fully dressed in her regular clothes because, they didn't think it was okay for women to be to be bared, and all they could do for her was essentially, use alcohol. But, it reminds me of the efforts to get people vaccinated. Queen Victoria was persuaded to use ether for the birth of her ninth child, I think it was, in order to make the birth process easier. And it reminds me of celebrities today, getting vaccinated or encouraging people to get vaccinated, a very similar way to popularize the use of anesthesia, which a lot of people, I think, were scared of.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's remarkable how seemingly unimportant things change the course of medicine. The first use of anesthesia in the mid 1800s was actually by a dentist whose last name was Crawford. He didn't have anything to do with medicine. He was a dentist, but the medical profession was wise enough to say, hey, this could work for us as well.
Well, dentistry can be just as painful as any kind, dentistry is ghastly. So I think anything that we can do to make it easy. The other thing that obviously was happening at the same time was that there wasn't much understood about germ theory. But if I remember this right, puerperal fever, which was often a plague created by midwives and doctors going from birth to birth without washing their hands or doing anything, the simple process of understanding that washing hands and sterilizing instruments could prevent or work to help infection. I mean, we're what, 30 in the 30s before we get to penicillin, and really it was World War II that ramped up the production of penicillin to the point where it had any popular use, because you just couldn't. That's the other problem with so much of this stuff, is how to make enough of it. I mean, it's the problem we're having with the vaccine. Even though we can create it, now they're talking about the Alzheimer's drug and the incredible cost it will be to try to use it. It isn't just developing a drug, it's actually producing it, and on a scale sufficient to help people. That is such an enormous problem.
Oh, it is. I once had to give a talk on antibiotics, and I picked penicillin because it has such an interesting story that Fleming, who won the Nobel Prize, the way he discovered penicillin is he was growing bacteria in a petri dish, and he left for holiday for the weekend, and he left the window open, and apparently some birds got in and contaminated the petri dishes with mold. And when Fleming got back to his lab, he looked, and around the mold there was no bacterial growth, and he said, wow, the mold must be producing something which inhibits bacterial growth, and that was found out to be penicillin. That's how it started.
Yeah, it's really, the old wives were not that dumb. And I was just looking through a book written by an Australian, and he's out somewhere in the middle of Aboriginal territory, the outback or something. And they're looking into Aboriginal medicine and, the local plants and so forth that were used for a great many cures or aids or whatever it is. And, mold was probably something that was used long, long ago without really understanding why it worked.
If you look back, excuse me, over the centuries, at some of the medicines that were used by the tribes, it's quite interesting. For example, in the South American tribes, they were using the bark from the chinchilla tree to treat malaria forever, and it worked.
I think that was probably observational. Natasha Pulley wrote a wonderful book about the search for that tree. Because the British were very big on sending out expeditions to bring back stuff to Kew Gardens where they could grow it and apply it. And I was thinking, it's Lauren Belfer who wrote a really gripping book about penicillin, and she started it off with a man in New York City who had fallen playing, I don't remember, squash or something, and scraped his knee very badly, and the infection that set in was killing him. And they had some penicillin at the facility, and they gave it to him, and he recovered, but then they ran out, and then he died. You know, and that I thought it was a brilliant illustration. Well, anyway, let's talk about I'm sorry, about the daughter of Sherlock Holmes. I don't get to talk about medicine all that often, and you can see that any fan of crime fiction, or actually any really well-read person, can learn a surprising amount about medicine without having any idea how to practice it. But you just pick up this stuff when you're reading interesting books. So 1917, what's going on? It's March and it's cold.
Yes. And the novel begins with Joanna Blaylock, the daughter of Sherlock Holmes, looking out of her window on Baker Street and seeing this woman parading back and forth in the rain. And she calls over Watson, her husband, and the senior Watson to look at the man, to the woman rather, and says, "What do you think?" And they said, "Well, she's obviously a middle-aged woman, perhaps a commoner on a shopping tour." And Joanna, demonstrating her Holmesian observation technique, said, no. It's raining. And she walks back and forth and she glances up at my window. She wants to come here. She wants to see me. And of course, later in the story, 5 or 10 minutes later, there's a knock on the door and the woman has come to see Joanna, because the woman, who's a very interesting character, her name is Adams is her last name, as I recall. She owns a pub in Whitechapel, and she's also a playwright. And she's written a play, and in the meantime, established a playhouse in Whitechapel, which is one of the poor areas of London. And she's doing Romeo and Juliet. And the Juliet's this lovely young actress who does a splendid job, whose name is Pretty Penny. And suddenly, without notice, Pretty Penny goes missing. And for that reason, Miss Adams comes to see daughter Sherlock Holmes to find Pretty Penny. The daughter is not terribly interested in this case, but it's a very boring time of year. The criminals of London seem to have taken a bit of a holiday, so she agrees. And as she searches for Pretty Penny, she also interacts with Lestrade, the inspector from Scotland Yard, who informs her that it seems that a Jack the Ripper type killer is on the loose again. And it comes to be that Joanna believes that this missing actress is now a captive of Jack the Ripper. And so runs this.
It's hard to, to duck Jack the Ripper if you were writing. I mean, Holmes was obviously in his heyday in the 1890s when the Ripper was actually at work. There's a new book out about the Victorian serial killer, Dr. Crean. And, there's some speculation his crimes were similar to the Ripper. And I gather that as he was being hanged, or just as he was about to drop with the hangman's noose, he said something to the effect that "I am Jack," and then, that was it. And so there's some supposition that maybe he was the Ripper, but he was a poisoner. And it seems really unlikely that he would. I've always thought that one possible explanation for the Ripper was because, back in the days when there wasn't data keeping and communication, that he just relocated. And there were certainly other crimes in the United States and so forth where he could have been continuing, but there wasn't enough data to try to figure it out. I mean, the modern understanding of serial killers is they don't quit. With few exceptions, they go on until they're caught. Although we have learned that recently there was I'm trying to remember, is it the Golden State Killer that recently got caught by modern medical technology, by DNA? And he apparently did stop. So maybe that is not an entirely.
Well, they never really caught Jack the Ripper.
No, not at all. They don't have any idea who he really was.
There was a recent, well, not a recent, few years back, Patricia Cornwall wrote a novel, Portrait of a Killer.
Right.
And she claims, because she has some knowledge in forensics, that she could prove who Jack the Ripper really was.
A painter.
I read the book and I was not convinced.
No, I don't think many people were at all convinced that it was really. I'm trying to remember which painter it was. Walter, what's his name? Or was it Sisley? I can't recall. It was a a painter at the time. And then, you know, there was speculation he was really the Prince of Wales, not George, but his older brother, because he was a strange guy.
Yeah.
You know, but I mean, it'll always be a mystery. I don't think there's any conceivable way that we could prove who Jack the Ripper. I don't know. I suppose on a wild hair, if they were able to hang on to any possible material from one of the victims that might have had DNA on it, and if they now go to ancestry.com or one of these DNA things, they might be able, through some torturous process, to establish a familial link. It'd be an interesting project, wouldn't it? And a really huge one, given the time elapsed.
Well, I thought initially when I saw the title that surely she had DNA proof. There was no other way to do it. And knowing the history of Jack the Ripper, who I'd read about rather extensively, I thought before I read the book, I said, oh, I recall now, Jack the Ripper sent several letters to the inspector of Scotland Yard, taunting him, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, I recall in modern day that when you lick the envelope, seal an envelope, some of your saliva may contain cells that could be the basis for DNA study. And that had to be it, but it wasn't. She looked at those letters and couldn't find any DNA on them. And
didn't they keep some of the clothes of the victims?
Oh yeah, they had the clothes, they had the letters that he wrote. They're still kept on. I don't think there's any secret to it, but you can't get to them without permission. But they had the clothes of the victims. They could never find any foreign DNA. They just could not do it.
Isn't that interesting? You have to wonder if he stayed gloved throughout, you know, which he certainly could have done.
Of course. But then again, you have to remember that back in the day, when we're talking 1917, they didn't have DNA, obviously. And even back then, they were just beginning with fingerprints. So most of the criminals, particularly the thieves, didn't bother with gloves because there was little chance they would get apprehended because of fingerprints or what have you. So I think back in 1917, the detectives had to use their wits a bit more than science.
Which is more fun for you as an author, no question about it. So anyway, Joanna launches herself reluctantly or just out of boredom, whatever it will be, into this investigation. And we can't really say much more about it, unfortunately. So let's go back and talk about your first Joanna Blaylock and tell me, why did you decide? I mean, I can understand it, but why is she married to a Watson? I mean, you're carrying the whole thing through to a great extent.
You're talking about the first Joanna who was married to Watson? Well, this is the story then. Joanna I guess we should go back to how Joanna came about.
Okay, that's a good question.
Right. How did it go? Because Sherlock Holmes was a loner. Never in 56 episodes do you ever read about him being attracted to a woman or being in love. Just didn't bother with it because he felt that love was an emotion that might interfere with his delicate thinking. So he stayed away from it altogether. Well, you mentioned Irene Adler, who was the only woman ever to outwit Sherlock Holmes. And Sherlock was not angry towards her, he rather admired her. He didn't particularly like her, but he admired her because she was so clever. And as the story ends in Scandal in Bohemia, in which Irene Adler outwitted Sherlock Holmes, Irene Adler leaves London. She's fallen in love with a lawyer, Godfrey Norton. They flee to Paris to live a life of ecstasy and happiness. But alas, Godfrey turns out to be a ne'er-do-well. He's a philanderer, a gambler, a no good. He's rarely home, and only time he comes to see her is when he needs money because Irene Adler is still an opera star. But the worst part of it is he's a bore. He's a dullard. And here we have Irene Adler, this very bright woman, with Sherlock Holmes, and she's stuck with a bore. Well, one night there's a knock on the door at 221B Baker Street. Holmes opens the door. Watson has moved away now. He's married, and standing before him is Irene Adler. And she gets right to the point. She says, I've made a terrible mistake. I've married a dull and a bore, and I need someone to have a conversation with, someone on my level. We can talk about puzzles, create crimes, do whatever you like. And of course, Holmes is delighted. He welcomes her in. They have a wonderful evening discussing crime, solving puzzles, drinking cognac, injecting each other with cocaine, and they end up in bed together. And the next morning, Holmes awakens, and Irene Adler is gone. No note, no goodbye, just gone. And of course, Holmes is delighted. He doesn't want to mess with this. He has no time for her. There's a murder in Mayfair he has to attend to. So life goes on. 8.5 months later, there's a knock on the door at 221 Baker Street. Holmes opens the door, and standing before him is a very pregnant Irene Adler and a very sick Irene Adler, because she's suffering from the toxemia of pregnancy. She has weeks to live. Her blood pressure is sky high, her kidneys are failing. She's come to see Sherlock, not to be the father, but to somehow have some security for the child to be born. Well, Holmes is not going to be a father, that's for sure, but it's a puzzle, and he loves to solve puzzles. So he contacts Watson, tells Watson the story, and they come up with the following, is that Irene Adler would give birth, the elder Dr. Watson would arrange for a adoption by a well-to-do couple, and Holmes and Watson would establish a trust fund so that the child to be born would never have financial problems. 2 weeks later, Irene Adler gives birth to a beautiful daughter who she names Joanna, but she only gets to hold and kiss that baby once before she dies. As promised, Watson arranges for an adoption, and Joanna is adopted by a wonderful middle-class family and grows up to be just a lovely woman, but smart as can be. And she loves detective stories, and she can solve mysteries faster than detectives can. But she's a woman. And in the early 1900s, women aren't detectives. They aren't doctors or lawyers. You're upper class in London as a woman. You're either married or you're a governess. Well, Joanna becomes a nurse because that allows her to use her wits. And she falls in love with John Blaylock, who's a surgeon, and she's happy. And they have a child, and she's hilariously happy. Little boy is named Johnny. But then disaster strikes because the surgeon, John Blaylock, comes down with cholera and dies. And Joanna and the child are taken in by Lord Blaylock, her father-in-law. And life goes on. She's not terribly happy, but at least she's secure, and her son has security and comfort. About 10 years later, Joanna and her little boy are walking down Curzon Street in London, and they watch a man fall to his death from 3 stories. They're differing stories about how it happened, but it appears to be quite certainly suicide. Anyhow, the man who falls to his death, his name is Charles Harrelson, and his sister comes around to see the elder Dr. Watson, who still gives advice. And she says, "Oh, Dr. Watson, you must take this case. You must, because my brother would never commit suicide." And of course, Watson not too interested in this. He says, "Well, perhaps you should go to Scotland Yard." She said, "I did, but to them, the case is closed." And Watson is still not interested. And she says, "But Dr. Watson, there are differing accounts of what happened. One account is given by a gardener, and the other account is given by Joanna Blaylock and her son." And of course, Watson is the only man living who knows the real identity of Sherlock Holmes' daughter. And he says, "I'll take the case." So he and his son, John, who helps him in various ways, go around to the Blaylock mansion. They meet Joanna Blaylock, and he tells Joanna, he says, "We are here, Ms. Blaylock, to investigate the death of Charles Harrelson." And Joanna Blaylock smiles mischievously and says, No, Dr. Watson. You are here to investigate the murder of Charles Harrelson. And thus begins the association between Joanna and the Watsons. Eventually, Joanna falls in love with the younger Watson. They marry and they move into 221B Baker Street, where the senior Watson still lives. They form this detective trio, if you will, and solve some of the most difficult cases in London. And as this novel, Abduction of Pretty Penny, begins, you see that Joanna Blaylock now has the same reputation as her father. She's very keen, very bright, and Sherlock Holmes depends on her. Thus,
You've had so much fun with this, haven't you? Is
Oh.
Lestrade the Lestrade? I mean, is he now a very senior member at Scotland Yard? Was he young enough to be still around in 1917?
Lestrade,
Yeah.
it's Lestrade's son.
Okay, so it is in fact another generation of
Right.
Lestrades as well.
Exactly.
And you know, that's actually a real hallmark of private investigators, amateur sleuths and so forth, that there really does have to be somewhere in the whole picture an actual police officer, an actual police presence, because Sherlock Holmes, no matter how bright he is and how great a detective, can't actually arrest anybody. So, you know, Lestrade is an important part, just like you have Inspector Japp with Poirot, and Miss Marple has her nephew, and Lord Peter has his brother-in-law Charles at Scotland Yard. And, you know, there does need to
Absolutely.
be somebody like Lestrade.
Absolutely. And look, Joanna Blaylock and the Watsons, they can't search a house, but
Right.
get Lestrade to get a warrant to search a house. And in one of the novels, Joanna's decided that the dead person is not really the dead person. They're buried, and she needs to have the body exhumed. Now, she could never get that done.
Right. Now it takes a court order. Yeah, it was not at all easy to.
That's
No,
right.
you're right. I mean, in order for there to be any kind of a trial, there does have to be proper procedure. Otherwise, whatever they get is tainted. I mean, and then you'd be forced to just, like, you know, shoot the bad guy or whatever. But you couldn't really put him through the justice system. Now you're still operating in a world of capital punishment, and the English were pretty brisk about it. If somebody, you know, went to trial and was found guilty of a capital crime, they had, I think it's only like 3 weeks or something before execution. They didn't mess around with lots of appeals and other stuff. So the stakes were very high, you know, for a killer. And therefore, I think it's, you know, there's a lessening of that today when we don't have capital punishment and people are talking about incarceration. It's not quite as dramatic as it was when in the period you're writing about, where if a murderer loses the battle with the detective, whoever the detective is, you know, it's pretty much game over.
Well, back in those days, in the early 1900s, you're right, they did not mess around. I mean,
Yeah.
during World War I, they captured some German spies, and 3 weeks later, they hung them
Yeah.
at the Tower of London and didn't think twice about it. So back in those days, they were rather on spot. They didn't take into consideration your background, your mental incapacities, or what have you. You were either guilty or you weren't. If you weren't, you paid the price.
Oh, it's absolutely true. As I said, it was a higher stakes game. If you read more, you know, we tend to think of the golden age crime, you know, crimes Miss Marple and something as being somewhat softer on the cozy side. But the truth is, you know, that they were much more brutal than many investigations today, because it did end up with somebody executed. And Miss Marple knew that, you know, when she would finger a killer, that basically, you know, it was going to be off to the hangman, which is a lot different than it works out today. I often find myself rooting when, I mean, I'm not being bloodthirsty, but just efficient. But when various terrorists and, you know, mass murders or whatever it is, or today, I always kind of wish that they just be killed in the process of apprehension. And so we didn't have to go through the circus that a trial now engenders, you know, with all the pleas of diminished responsibility and mental illness and all. I mean, all that is true, but at the end of the day, this person's crimes still were tremendous. I just looked at something, a very disturbing book about Jeffrey Dahmer in Milwaukee. And, you know, the whole, all the pleas, you know, that were entered about the fact that he, you know, tortured and killed all kinds of gay Black young men or older men, for all I know. And it was just a horrendous, I don't really care what the mitigating circumstances were, if there were, you know, if you want to call them that. And in fact, he was sent to prison. He wasn't executed, and someone in prison executed him, which is sometimes what actually happens with cases like that. I mean, they're talking about, what's his name, the Minneapolis police officer convicted of actually killing George.
Shave.
Yeah, Derek, thank you. And, you know, they're going to have to keep him in solitary. So, you know, that's a pretty, maybe that's actually worse than execution. I don't know, never having lived in solitary, but, you know, it's a whole different justice and prison system now than at the time you are writing about. So even Joanna has to recognize that if she captures the killer, you know, the consequences are going to be drastic.
And in addition, you must remember that the prisons back in the early 1900s were horrid.
Yeah,
They were
really awful. You're so right. I've toured the one in Dublin, a very famous prison in Dublin, and it wasn't a place that I've actually been to San Quentin as well. And that was not a place that I would have wished to spend any time.
Right. I read extensively, never visited Pentonville, which was one of the more drastic prisons outside of London. And if you got sentenced to Pentonville, you didn't get off for good behavior. You served every day of that sentence. And while you were there, you worked. And if you were lucky, you lived. Yeah,
no, that's really true. And, you know, we were watching Bosch the other night, and Bosch's partner loses his cool because he's disintegrating during the course of this last season. And when they go to pick up a couple of firebombers, Jerry loses it and, you know, assaults him. And then there's just a, you know, a forest of cell phones and the whole bit that come into play. And I mean, I'm all fine with holding the police accountable and, you know, preventing the kinds of things that happened to George Floyd. But at the same time, I think it's harder and harder to actually be a police officer and, you know, tread a fine line between protecting yourself or the community or the bystanders or a victim and the rights of the killer. So I'm glad that I'm not on the force. And I also think it presents greater problems for writers of crime fiction, you know, how to deal with all of these things. I mean, forever corrupt police officers or corrupt presidents, for example, were not a part of this genre. I mean, you were supposed to be able to trust the police or trust your government, and all of that's kind of blown away now. And so, you know, the certainties with which you could operate in 1917 are not the same today.
That's why I enjoy writing about 1917.
No, I totally get it. You know, It makes a lot more sense. Well, tell me this. This is what, book 4 in this series, or is it 5?
Book 5.
Book 5. So do you have future plans?
I have 2 more to do on the current contract. And now they're talking about doing another 2 after that.
Wonderful.
So I'm all good. I was, I'll tell you a quick little story that it was spontaneous response. I was being interviewed locally, and the interviewer, a very nice lady, said, well, how many daughter Sherlock Holmes have you written? I said, well, 5. And she said, and the others in the works. I said, there'll be 2 more. And she said, well, goodness, how many do you plan to write? And my response was, how many would you like?
Oh, good for you. You know, I think as seniors, we have to take on long range projects, even if we're not entirely sure we're going to see them to completion.
I know, but it gives you a future. I like that.
I do too. It's one reason I'm still running the Poison Pen, because what
Oh,
would I do?
oh, I think you've got a great bookstore. As you may recall, I was invited there some years ago, and we had just a grand time. Brian Friedman was the other
Yep.
who was there.
He's a wonderful author. Yes, you have a
Oh,
lot in common with Brian. I think he's terrific.
yeah, I mean, we both agreed we would have a fantastic, wonderful time at that bookstore.
Well, we'd be very happy to see you back. We do have live events coming online in the fall. Actually, we have one on July 6th, and then we have 2 or 3 in August, but then it's getting better as the fall goes. But that's assuming that the Delta and other variants of COVID don't, create adverse conditions. I mean, I don't think we can plan with absolute certainty for anything at the moment, but on the other hand, eventually the 1919 flu settled down some and people carried on with their lives. So we'll just have to see. A year is a long time when you're living through it, but if you're looking back through the course of history, a year is not that long. So we'll just have to see how it works out.
I heard a very interesting talk last month by an epidemiologist at Johns Hopkins, very bright guy. His name is McCarty. And people talking about the variants now turning up of the COVID-19 virus. And he made a very interesting point. He said, that's not at all uncommon. The viruses, as you go along, they do have variants, he said, but invariably, the variants are a lot weaker than the original strain.
Well, as I understand it, this one's more contagious, but I don't know.
Yeah, more contagious, but far less lethal.
Right. Well, that's true of regular flu. I mean, every year when you get a flu shot, they're taking their best guesses to which variant, is the most likely to get you. And I suspect, I mean, we were fully vaccinated back in early February, that we're going to need a booster shot like we do a regular flu shot. And, they'll try this a bit of a moving target, but they will try to get it. What I really don't understand people who don't want to get vaccinated. I mean, grew up, with polio as a specter, and I'll never forget how excited we were, how thrilled, and how we all flocked to get the Salk vaccine the minute it was available. So I'm completely unable to figure out what's going on at the moment, why anyone would roll the dice against getting COVID, which has some horrible repercussions.
Yeah, particularly if you're in the high risk group.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're above the age of 50 and don't get that vaccine, you must live in another world. Or if you have.
Yeah, it's interesting. They had an article in the Washington Post about teenagers with parents that are opposed to it are now, sneaking around. They used to sneak around, to get liquor or get drunk or, now they're sneaking around to go and get a COVID vaccination to, to protect themselves. So, well, I don't want to digress into that, but I mean, it's interesting how no matter how we go with history, the same things roll back at us. And even though we know more, we really do know more and science is better, it's surprising that people haven't really caught up.
Well, I often remember a line from Ecclesiastes. It's so true. It goes, what has been done will be done again. There's nothing new under the sun. And it's true.
Yeah, no, it's totally true. Well, I'm delighted we had a chance to talk, and I'm really happy to know that there will be more Joanna Blaylock. And if you have a chance to come back to Scottsdale, assuming that we can do live events, I hope you will, Leonard.
I will try my best. And thank you again for the chat. I had a good time.
Well, I did too. It was really fun to talk to you, and I've really enjoyed your books, and so have a lot of our customers. So thanks for writing them. Bye, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day. Actually, you could join us to talk to Ellie Griffith, and later this evening we're going to be talking to Paul Doiron and Luann Rice. One of the things about Zoom that we couldn't do when events were live is we can do multiple events in one day, which would have been harder. So it's been a lot of fun. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Leonard. Bye.